Excellent. Thank you, Matthew. And you are correct. Our next presentation is from Paul Speaker from West Virginia University. Paul, the floor is yours.
Oh, good. Good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are. Nice to be able to be with you today. As Matthew said through his introduction, he said this very politely, but I am the oddball in the group in the sense that I am a finance professor here in the John Chambers College of Business and Economics at West Virginia University. And so some of the first things you may want to wonder is why do we have somebody from finance here? Why the economics training? And part of that is what we want to talk about here, and some of the data that I'm going to be able to use in this presentation comes from a thing called Project Foresight, a project that was begun here at West Virginia University several years ago, where this came into play from Max Houck, who was here at the time in the Forensic Science Initiative at WVU. So the FBI had moved its fingerprint identification facilities from the DC area to West Virginia. Thank you, Senator Byrd. And with thousands of professional jobs in the area, the university got heavily involved with that in trying to do what they could to be able to support the facility. And one of those things was an idea that Max Houck had, which was, how do we help the business side of forensics and the management of laboratories direction, and how do you kind of figure out what's going best there? And that's kind of where I came in, was introduced to this. I'm going to just introduce you to our Project Foresight webpage here, just to get a look at this, if you will. This is the project where we do collect data on forensic laboratories. And so I would be remiss in speaking to any group of forensic scientists if I did not invite you to please join Project Foresight. So this is our website. If you just Google WVU, West Virginia University, and the word Foresight, it'll bring you to the URL that has this information. But it's a project where we collect data, and this will describe how to be able to do it as you go through the page. It has a data collection tool, which is quite simple, a thing we call LabRat. It's the laboratory reporting tool that we use. And what it does by participating is, one, it gives you some great analysis of your laboratory, but more importantly, it provides your data as part of the overall picture of the entirety of all crime laboratories around the world. And so this enables us to be able to answer some of the questions that we are looking at today. The annual reports are made available in here, so you could certainly look through any of these through the years. What we do is we provide an individualized report for every participating laboratory that places their data side by side with the data of everybody else. And this will talk you through, there's a variety of videos in here that show you kind of how to work your way through. So please, if you are not a Foresight participating laboratory, we don't share your data in the sense of identifying you, but we do use your data to be able to answer some really important questions here. So part of what I'm going to go through with the slides that I share with you will be coming from data that we secured in Project Foresight. And part of this is going to be really talking about what some others around the country and around the world have done to be able to extract some of this research data and be able to tell you some things on the use of dollars that go into this, what has been very, very effective, and in some cases, what has not been. So with that introduction, let me come back here and I'll pick up my slideshow here and go ahead and get that started. So as I said, this is just looking at the economic arguments surrounding sexual assault kit testing. And much of this was really prompted by the knowledge that there were so many kits nationwide that had not been submitted to the laboratory. And a lot of areas certainly question why. A lot of knee-jerk reactions to this in terms of what the impacts were going to be. And so there's a body of work that's out there that I'd like to talk about with this. Now, you might ask the question, why do we need to have something from an economist's viewpoint on this? Shouldn't the moral arguments or the ethical arguments on testing be enough with this? And the reality is that it is not enough, and that what we're doing is to try to take a look at the business model that goes along with this that may help explain on the use of funds for this. So, the reality is when it comes to public funding, it's not unlimited. Just look at what this past year has been in efforts to be able to get some national legislation passed. There's arguments, and yes, indeed, I am from the state of West Virginia. And so one of our senators has been very much in the news along with this, but part of that is certainly this argument, are we being fiscally responsible? And it's not unlimited funds. So funding for testing of sexual assault is in competition, certainly with other things within the laboratory itself. So how do you prioritize your DNA testing in total? How do you prioritize testing for DNA versus, testing because of the opioid crisis? Or how do you compare that for any of the uses in the lab? And as Matthew or any other crime laboratory leader is going to tell you, they do have limitations on what they're going to be capable of testing. It's not necessarily a desire not to test things, it's a prioritization that fits in. So we take the data from the laboratories and we attempt to show, various kinds of metrics that help to make that decision. And it's decisions in terms of public sector funding, government sector funding, that is not just the laboratory deciding how to allocate funds from within, but the laboratory is competing with other uses in the Justice Department. Is it better to put more money towards prosecution, or should you put more towards policing? Or where does the lab fit in on the allocation of funds? How does the justice system begin to compete with other things? Infrastructure, which we are certainly debating now. Our new roads, bridges, fixing things that potentially could cause some type of harm. Or what about things like the arts or parks or any of the things, and even, go so far as what you may have on building a wall. So all of these things are competing. And what we are capable of doing in our studies is to begin to provide some metrics that are directly comparable. So when I say we need laboratories' data, this is how we can go ahead and generate an argument on one direction or the other about how public dollars are being used. What is the return on investment, for example? How efficient are they? Should dollars be given to everybody, or should they be concentrated? We go ahead and demonstrate and provide these types of metrics to be able to deal with this. And this will be the foundation of much that I'm going to talk about in here. So some of the things that I'd like to go through here with you in the short time that we do have is, first of all, we hear this term cost-benefit analysis and get a sense of a little bit of danger of what this actually means. In conducting this, what should you measure? What are the relevant things to be looking at when you're going through a cost-benefit analysis? As I mentioned, Project Foresight and crime laboratory data. I want to talk a little bit more detail about what we have there and what we do with this. And then I want to talk about some of the research of colleagues around the world. So the importance of the DNA database and what kind of returns you're getting there. So there are a couple authors that I'd like to be able to talk about with there. Then this very basic notion, why do we even have economics as an area of study, is it fits in with something that is known as the economic problem. It's one that you and I deal with in our own lives. Then there's a nice body of literature that's been developed in just looking at the backlog, or looking at the backlog of unsubmitted kits. More recent estimates have put this at somewhere between 300,000 and 400,000 kits still outstanding. So what have we learned from that? What does it tell us? And then once we go from there, what does it tell us about new kits, new sexual assault kits as they come into the laboratory? Policies, how should you attack that? And again, there's been some very interesting things. There's some that can be taken from what has been learned in these wholesale backlog studies, but there's other things that have been done with, what happens with machine learning? How does this compare to the experts? What kind of prioritization should we have? Even looking at some of the more recent things with rapid DNA technology. And is that, the expense of that, is that worth the while? And certainly with all of this it's not just dollar measures, but we certainly have time. And how do we look at that? What is the advantages of being able to test more quickly with this? So each of these are things that we want to be able to talk about in here. So let's first take a look at this notion of cost benefit, and what are we talking about when we use the term cost benefit. So the first thing we want to look at this is, as economists are talking about a term called the marginal cost versus the marginal benefit. What this means is, if you choose an action, what is the additional? What happens at the margin? Is the additional expenditure, how does that compare to what is the additional benefit that you're going to receive? Now, certainly when we talk about things in the public sector, we'd like to be able to know that your tax dollars, if we take $1 and in taxes, you'd like to be able to see that society gets at least $1 return in terms of benefit. And hopefully you're going to be able to get something even more than that. Now, I'll talk about return on investment from within here, and we've got that at the bottom here. But keep in mind, from a business standpoint, what makes a good return on investment? And you can look at companies that are being traded in the stock market to get a sense of that. But if you look across time, the leading companies on the Dow Industrials, their typical year, if they're getting a 10% return on investment, that's generally considered a pretty darn good thing. So the standards and the numbers we're going to present here from public sector investments are really mind-blowing in terms of the magnitude, how large these things are. Now, when we talk about cost, frequently we use a term in economics called the opportunity cost. And basically, if I do this, it means I'm not doing something else. So you can think of this certainly from the standpoint of the crime laboratory that has a fixed dollar budget. It means if they pursue a case looking at, say, trace evidence, and if that case and trace evidence costs them, let's say, $8,000, that $8,000 couldn't be spent elsewhere. So for $8,000, how many opioid test cases could you have handled? Or how many DNA cases or sexual assault kit cases? So a lot of our measures are going to be that I've given up an opportunity or delayed an opportunity to do something else to be able to look at that cost. And when you see things like the increases in turnaround time at the laboratories, that becomes a greater and greater sense of what some of these time costs might be. We also have from the cost, there are costs to the individual. So if somebody has been the victim of a sexual assault, there are costs that we certainly want to be able to measure there that are very, very important. And we look at certainly the physical health that goes from that kind of trauma, and also the mental health costs and how long they extend. and how serious those things may be, and in many cases, how permanent they may be. The idea, post-traumatic stress disorder and how that fits in. Can we measure these kinds of things? But also, what does it do to that individual's life? How do they live their life differently? Those costs. And then you extend it to family and friends. So if any of you have, been a friend or a family member of somebody who has suffered through an assault, you can begin to recognize how this has had an impact on your life. So you've got all of these measures. And then to society in general. If you look at heat maps of crimes in various cities, for example, you'll notice in metropolitan areas where there might be a university, that while the university is in session, that may be where a very large number of sexual assaults occur. Well, how has that changed what everybody else living in that area does in terms of investments in extra security measures and the policing that you have to spend that goes in there? So there's lots of costs that we want to be able to measure here when we're talking about these opportunity costs. There's also another measure that comes from health economics that some of you may be familiar with, and that is this idea of a quality adjusted life year. And it's a metric that can be used across any type of injury or impact that is had there in terms of what does that do to the quality of your life and adjusted lifetime that you might have. So there are other metrics between simple dollar metrics. A lot of the dollar metrics are going to look at this for people who have been victimized from any kind of crime, and all the discussies, the value of a statistical life is generally going to find its way into these kinds of metrics. So you'll see this mentioned in many of these, but it's many of these studies. And most of the benefits you get from testing are costs that are avoided. So if by increased testing, if a test all program, or clearing that entire backlog of untested kits, if that has an impact on reducing future crime, it's a cost avoided. And we use statistical procedures to go ahead and estimate what has been saved. Now, two measures that I'll talk about here, and most studies are going to use because these are comparable to other types of activities that might be used. One of these is return on investment. Return on investment is a pretty simple measure. It was, what was your net gain? Your benefits minus your costs. So what did you get in net more than you put in relative to the investment that you made? So again, if you return to the stock market here, if this was a measure that was just 10%, in other words, the benefit was 110% of the 100% investment. 10% return, that's a good thing when we're talking about our own personal investments. Another way you may see it is you get this many dollars back per dollar spent. So benefit per dollar spent. So frequently a metric that is used to talk about what is the value of the arts and investment and public investment in the arts. And a lot of times you'll see in metropolitan areas, for example, that it may be 8-to-1, $8 back for every dollar that you invest. Okay, and so we'd like to be able to put things that happen from the standpoint of the crime lab in those terms, so you get a nice dollar comparison. So what should we measure? Well, the answer is everything. Everything that is affected by an action that you take. So one of the pieces that we want to talk about here is work that talks about additions to the DNA database. How does that affect everything? What's the dollar amount? As I said before, we want to measure the cost to the individual, both the direct cost and the indirect costs, the cost of family and friends, costs of security and prevention that are reacted, public sector costs, policing, crime labs, courts, jails, prisons, all of these things. If you have programs in place that have the impact of reducing crime, then that means less expenditures on some of these other things. So we want to try to capture that and estimate what they're going to be. Okay, so what do we learn from Project Foresight and the crime laboratory data? So the project itself, I said, began following the movement of the FBI's fingerprint identification facility to Clarksburg, West Virginia, which is about 30 miles south of where we are at West Virginia University. So this is a program that began by Max Houck and was really a vision he had of how we could be more than just recognizing that bench scientists were promoted within labs to eventually take things over, be able to say, well, what can we give them in terms of managerial skills, and what can we learn and share that's happened with others to find out what's working and share it with everybody else, and things that aren't working, be able to look at it and say, let's change. We have data on this from fiscal year 2006 all the way to the present. Last year, we had 185 laboratories or laboratory systems that participated. So again, we encourage all labs to get it in. It's kept anonymously, but it does help for the overall base to be able to tell more about the industry. We collect information on casework, on the allocation of personnel within the laboratory, and on the expenditures, on their financials. And so one of the things we learn with this is that when we're talking about sexual assault kits, there is a concept in economics known as economies of scale. So if you look at the data here, these are laboratories' average cost to review a case relative to their caseload. And this is exactly what we would expect in economic theory, is that as you see this U-shaped curve here, as you process more and more, you begin to find that your average costs fall to up to a certain point. Then eventually they're going to go back up. But what that means is that the cost, the investment that you need to make, say in testing a sexual assault kit, is going to be relative to your workload. So smaller laboratories, their costs are going to be much higher. And it's not a matter of they're not working well. It's just that the efficiency that you gain is, you can see somewhere in there, somewhere short of 10,000 cases per year, tends to get you the least cost results. That's going to then influence what the return on investment is going to be. So as we look through things, it's not a single answer for everybody in terms of the gains that they can expect. Now, there are several publications that I recommend, and I'll talk a little bit about each of these. The first of these came out of the Stanford Business School, and it was really looking at the backlog of testing to say, well, let's look at what's happened so far on testing these backlogs and what have we learned. And so Larry Wine, along with one of his graduate students there, put this together in the Journal of Forensic Sciences, and it's a fascinating approach where they take a very conservative view of data they have at that point and figure out, is this worth it? I followed that up the following year in looking at, well, what happens when you begin to go forward to de novo cases? What does this imply? How can we take their data and project forward? We also have some work in here. I want to talk about that Jen Doliak from Texas A&M, previously at the University of Virginia, now Texas A&M, that she has done on what happens when you have additions to the database, and what does that do towards crime? What kind of returns could you expect there? She follows that up with a couple of European economists, and they take a look at a much bigger one in the effect of databases across different kinds of crimes. And they're able to show that the largest impacts are with respect to sexual assaults. So questions about, should offenders as well as arrestees, should you add arrestees to what goes in? What kind of impacts can you expect? There is a follow-up piece of work that Larry Wine and an additional group of co-authors from Stanford Business School do in looking at machine learning and what that can tell us. And I think it offers some really interesting things. This was done in cooperation with the San Francisco laboratory. So you can see Mark Powell is one of the co-authors on that. And it also stresses, as Matthew said, the importance of working laboratories along with researchers to be able to accomplish more. Just 2 months ago, Regina Wells from the Kentucky State Police Lab and I put something there on what we learned from rapid DNA testing and returns on investment there. And then there's a forthcoming book, hopefully that'll be out sometime this year. I've got a piece where I collected a number of these things that we're talking about here today on simply where do we go? Where are we moving forward with respect to the economics on this? So let me talk just a little bit about each of these and some of the key results that we see from this. So Jen Doliak's initial work that she had in 2017 provides a really interesting response. What happens when there's a single addition to the DNA database? What is the return to society? And this, of course, is not just from sexual assault. It's from all additions that you fit in there from any kind of crime. And she says the return may be as high as $20,000. That's not for one hit. That's for one addition. So when you consider that the cost is relatively low, anywhere from $25 up to $100 per entry, to be able to get 20,000 back on average from that is pretty remarkable. She goes on to look at this with her colleagues in Europe, and what they're able to show in the second piece is fascinating because it talks about the impact on specific crimes. So you can see here I have this notion of eta is equal to negative 2.7. This is what is known as an elasticity. And basically what it says is that a 1% increase in additions to the DNA database, when we talk about sexual assault, 1% increase means a 2.7% decrease in assaults. So it really lends a lot of support to jurisdictions that are considering, do you add arrestees to just convictions in the database? And it's a very strong argument in favor of doing more in that direction. Now, one of the things that we have seen here on this economic problem is simple. We have limited resources and unlimited desires. So what happens? Where do things have to give? And what we've seen, if you look over the 2013 to 2020 period, the reason I chose that is that coincides with the opioid crisis and the real growth in that. So in 2013 was the first year that we had a state with more than 30 deaths per 100,000 population from drug overdoses. And that, of course, was my state, West Virginia, and now the numbers are huge that have gone in there. Well, labs can't just do everything. If they have to take budget from one place and put it into another, they're going to do so. So what have we seen happen over this period of time as we've dealt with the opioid crisis and the backlog of previously unsubmitted sexual assault kits? Blood alcohol turnaround time has gone up by 29% per year. And you can see all of these numbers for this. Tox cases has certainly gone up. We push things on the back burner to be able to deal with these issues. So there are key resource needs for the laboratories. Now, a number of other things we've seen here. What has happened to the backlog on not just the turnaround time, but you'll see these huge growths in the backlog. The growth in the costs have been a little bit more modest on an annual basis, higher than inflation in terms of what the costs are, but they've been growing under control. And a lot of that we've seen things here, but specifically for DNA casework, costs are rising slowly because we're getting these economies of scale. Labs productivity has gone way up. We're getting more out of every person working in the lab. The amount that they're examining is increasing, but turnaround time is going. And it's one of the factors that laboratories face. The better they get at things, the more is being submitted. So there is a real need for additional resources for the labs. Now, when we look at testing the backlog, this was the key work that was done by Larry Wine and his folks, but he borrowed from several of these others, Rebecca Campbell's work, some work in criminology, work in various areas, but he uses primarily the Bashford work that was done in New York City. And this is just looking at the backlog, and although they tested 3,777 backlog cases, what they came up with as a metric was looking at 49 convictions with this. And what they were able to show in this is that was a return of $81 for every dollar spent. So testing the backlog, and you'll notice in here that a lot of these cases, they didn't proceed any further because the statute of limitations had run out, that there was, too much time had taken place on this, but still generated $81 for every dollar spent. So a clear argument to test the backlog. We took that a step further and began to look at this from the standpoint, if you took every new case that came in, you don't have statutes running out. You don't have people already under arrest, and the expected convictions, and convictions just being one metric, went up to, out of that same group, to 252 rather than the 49. The range of return on labs, because of these economies of scale, even the smallest of labs that just does a very, very small volume, we estimated a return of $99 for every $1. And if we looked at the large DNA labs, it was as much as $646 for every dollar spent, where they were generating somewhere around perfect economies of scale. So the argument was clear. You want to test everything. Now, just some more recent advances that have come in here that are really worth taking a look at. One was this, the group studying the San Francisco one, looking at what's the difference between machine learning, if you had a sexual assault kit, to select what is the best part of that kit to be able to test, versus having your expert, and the expert being, say, an expert within the laboratory, or even the sexual assault nurse examiner on this, is they found the machine learning was a much better approach, although for society's return, test everything was there. Now, we followed that up with the study that I mentioned on the Kentucky State Police, and taking a look at the Andy system that they had on rapid DNA. And much was learned by this that fit in there. Note that, hopefully we'll be looking at Thermo Fisher Scientific in the future to see how they responded in terms of these two rapid DNA methodologies that are approved by the FBI. But to be able to look at the return on investment, we found the return on investment for rapid DNA was dramatic. And the reason it was so dramatic is the time saved from a process from when the assault happens to when they have actual DNA that can be checked against the DNA database, very, very short, versus getting into the queue for the entire laboratory and DNA. That could be, in many cases, 9-10 months or more. That the number of assaults that you prevented from repeat assaults was really, really dramatic. A future development we would like to be able to see as a research topic would be combining these, the idea of machine learning and rapid DNA technology. So I've talked nonstop there. I apologize for all of that. I had my other screen up on this, but I think we have time for a couple questions in here before we break.
That is correct. Matthew, I'm going to send it over to you for the question and answer session, and then we'll go into a break.
Thanks, Tyler. So question coming in from Lisa. Dr. Speaker, do you find that laboratories are often unwilling to keep track of statistics, since the stats may result in less work being done in cases, since there may be fear of revealing huge expenses at a time when labs are being asked to cut back?
It's one of the things that always concerned us, is that we would like to get the data from labs And we never want anybody to be punished for doing the right thing, to try to help, what I would say is the industry overall of all labs. And it's part of the reason that we've kept everything anonymous from that standpoint. So we created a method for laboratories if they wanted to just find out how they were doing, to participate, but to not have something that might be necessarily discoverable from us. And we have a backdoor way people can send data and get into the study that way. But we've never had a FOIA request on any of our participants with this. And most have found that there are some areas in which they're performing really, really well, and some things that they can brag about. And, I didn't mention this, but we do have a thing called the Maximus Awards that we recognize high-performing laboratories. And so far, everybody in that group likes being recognized. You like to see your name in the paper when it's not being beat up about something that didn't go right, and to have somebody, an outside group like ourselves, be able to say, you're one of the best. So it has not turned out to be a problem.
And I think most laboratories, Paul, I would ask if you agree, but I think most laboratories are really looking for those efficiencies. They're trying to better their business case and trying to be more efficient with the public funds that they're given.
Yeah, and we found that one of the projects that we did, I did not mention, is our workforce calculator. So if you go to the Forensic Technology Center of Excellence website and put in workforce calculator, that will give you a very quick answer as, again, an independent view of when you need more resources. And so we've had quite a few that have been able to use that and to leverage that into a good independent argument as to, yes, we really need the resources. We're not just crying wolf.
Paul, a question coming in the chat again. With the increased cost per sample for rapid DNA, is it really cost effective compared to the more traditional lab testing? Your opinion?
We certainly have found that. We've tested that in the case of sexual assault. It's dramatic how cost effective it is on this. And the reason is the time. Is that if you think of, for a serial rapist and how frequently they operate and for how long a period of time in there, if you can reduce this by 5, 6, 8, 10 months on this, you have prevented as many as, say, an average of, I think, 5 assaults. And so if you look at the societal cost, not just the cost to the individual, but to all of society that comes from that, it's dramatic as to how cost effective it makes it.
And Paul, just to follow up to that, your thoughts on if a lab was working within 15 or 30 days on sexual assault kits, if they were resourced to be able to do that, would your answer still hold?
Oh, absolutely. To be able to handle in that period of time. Now, to be able to do it in that short period of time, if they're using rapid DNA, that's great. If they're not, and they're able to extend to that period of time, well, then they probably got the results rapidly without this other technology. But what I would anticipate is you're going to see, this is, again, it's an economies of scale argument in terms of what the cost is going to be, and a competitive situation right now. So as more adopt the use of this, as it finds its way, say, into booking agents, to be able to get it while they've got an arrestee and be able to test against the database, it's going to bring the cost down for everybody, and perhaps make this the go-to methodology.
Yeah, just a couple of housekeeping items, Paul. I know that you've worked extensively with the FTCOE to make the workforce calculator available. That is a resource that's available through the FTCOE. We appreciate them making the funding and also that resource available on their website. Paul continues to work with them on the development of that. We've got beta. I don't know what version we're on now, but certainly that's developed over time, and we appreciate your work there. Another comment coming in. Sorry, there was one more question. I'm just going to pause back in the chat here. And the question, Paul, you and I have talked a lot about this, but factoring in quality. How do you factor in quality with some of these economic metrics?
Well, and from an economist standpoint, that's a big question. So one of the things we do in the comparative database is we only include the comparative database accredited laboratories. So you have a certain quality standard that fits in there. Now, that said, it doesn't matter if a laboratory is accredited or not to be able to get a comparative report done. But we compare everybody to the standards of accredited laboratories, and we use that as the best we can do for quality control. Going beyond that, it gets too difficult to be able to acquire enough data to have relevant comparisons.
Great answer. Paul, I really appreciate all of your work here. There's so much more that we weren't even able to talk about. I think we could probably talk for days just on the work and the publications. We appreciate all of your work and your presentation today. Again, just a teaser, these presenters will be available later on today. We'll do a round robin format with all of the presenters so that we can get more of your questions answered, and they probably have a lot of questions for each other as we've been presenting today. So with that, Tyler, I think we're going to throw it to a break. Is that correct?